June 1976. And then, suddenly, the pain cleared and all his blood rushed to his head. As previously all his blood had been gushing out of a ragged wound in his throat, this could only be considered an improvement. And then he opened his eyes and saw that he was being dangled in mid-air by his ankles, courtesy of Harry Potter, who seemed to have lost his glasses. Harry Potter, who seemed to have gained the company of a 2 years dead, 20 years younger Sirius Black, as well as a less scarred Remus Lupin and Wormtail. That wasn't Harry Potter, and this was all too familiar. And a young redhead, who was not, in fact, Ginny Weasley, said, "Let him down." Severus Snape groaned, muttered, for Merlin's sake, "Not this again," and wordlessly summoned his wand, which smacked satisfyingly into his hand. He countered the jinx and righted himself, floating to the ground with as much grace as a hallucinating dead man can muster. He landed in front of, well, he might as well admit it, the late James Potter, who was staring at him, mouth open. Severus pulled his wand on him. Potter froze. How satisfying. "Potter," he spat, 15 years teaching instinct kicking in. "I have had quite enough. You will immediately stop this nonsense. If you attempt to surprise me again in such a manner, you will immediately find yourself in multiple pieces with no hope of restitution, and as I can only presume Mr. and Mrs. Potter would, for whatever reason, monsieur," he sneered, "let us both strive to prevent that unfortunate, but by no means inevitable scenario, shall we?" Potter's mouth hung open stupidly. He barely managed to muster a weak "Water?" Severus stared him down over the tip of his wand. Potter didn't move. Neither, strangely, did Black, Lupin, or Pettigrew, or any of the other students gathered for the spectacle. In fact, every single person on the shore of the lake was staring at him. It was disconcerting. Severus nodded at the still gaping Potter, tried and failed to avoid glancing at the young redhead, and stalked off towards the castle with a customary flourish of his worn, greying too short. This was the strangest dream end-death hallucination he had ever. He had almost reached the castle when the voice he'd never managed to forget called out from behind him. "Sev?" He stopped. "Sev, wait a second." Severus turned around, and there she was. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. Severus raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "You know very well what I mean," Lily said. "How did you... Since when could you put Potter in his place like that? What happened to you?" She gestured vaguely at his all red-faced and sputtering and bloodies and inappropriate suggestions about his mother and everything. "How are you so calm? Did someone cast a soap-mouth hex on you? And that's putting aside the wandless Actio. Where has that been hiding all this?" It had been 20 years since he'd heard one of Lily's disjointed speeches, and yet his subconscious was still somehow capable of providing one for him. It was almost amusing, really. Unless somehow... "Lily?" Severus asked before he could stop himself. "Yes, what?" Lily replied, a little testily. "It's not actually you, Severus said slowly. "It's not. Is it?" "What?" Lily repeated. "Severus, you didn't hit your head when Potter flipped you upside down, did you?" The response was so perfectly Lily, so completely outside anything he would ever think to say, that Severus did something he hadn't done in at least 5 years. He laughed. Lily blinked at him. "I am exploring new depths of my subconscious," he said by way of explanation, and he couldn't help himself. He reached out a hand to her. She took it. When Lily took his hand, the amalgam of shock, amusement, and Merlin forbid hope, these long-forgotten emotions that were all battling for supremacy in his not-empty mind. Did one find emotions in the mind or elsewhere? They were intangible, but they exploded all the same into 1,000 tiny particles that ran up his fingers and along his arms straight into his spine. She was real. He was touching her. Yes, she was so young. 16 to be precise, and given the state of his unstained, even bonier, shorter but still fairly long, fingers he hadn't dared to look at his left forearm. He was physically the same age, And, more importantly, not at all bleeding to death from a gaping throat wound. And he had put the ever-entitled Potter, the elder, quite firmly in his place. He wasn't dead. He wasn't dead unless this was an afterlife, and for all Severus' faults, blind optimism could not be said to be one of them. As a terrible person who had enjoyed mocking the adherents of any and all religions for many years, 23, Severus had no doubts that, if there were an afterlife, he would not be getting an invitation to the good sort. And here he was, 16 years old, with the 16-year-old love of his life. Which serpent venoms have hallucinogenic properties. Ophiophagous hanna and Najanabi hallucinogenic, when dehydrated and inhaled, but the Indian alchemists tended to mix the venom sacs with potent cannabis, so their reports were somewhat less than reliable. And he'd done so many tests on Nagini under the guise of caring for her that hallucinogenic properties would surely not have gone undetected. A time-turner. The time-turners had been destroyed in 1996, a pensive malfunction brought on by ill-executed memory extraction. He had already diverted from the original memory. Perhaps he was truly there. But why? Why? Severus blinked rapidly. "I beg your pardon," he murmured, occluding his face to a safe neutral. Lily was waving her free hand in front of his face. "Why are you staring at me, Sev? Are you quite there? You haven't said anything for a whole minute." Severus allowed her hand to drop. "My apologies, Lily," he said smoothly. "Please forgive me. I've been rather lost in thought." Lily was looking at him askance. "I can see that. Sev, are you going to explain to me what happened out there?" Severus ran his fingers over his wand, not so smooth as it had been 22 years later, and shook his head. "What can I say?" he said mildly. Potter needed to be put in his place. "I'll say, but how did you possibly—" "It's amazing what one can do when one distances oneself from one's baser emotional reactions," Severus said, "which I have resolved to do." Lily blinked at him. "What?" Severus swallowed. "I'm trying to think before I act," he said. Well, it worked. Lily smiled at him. "I've seen you do a couple of wordless spells here and there, but I've never seen you do wandless before." Severus shrugged. "It's not," Lily bit her lip. "It's not something you learned from your other friends this year, is it?" Severus snorted. "Those imbeciles, I think not." Seeing the relief in her eyes, he added incidentally, "I don't believe I'll be spending further time with them. They add nothing to my academic career, and their social company leaves much to be desired." "That's great," Lily said. "That's really wonderful. You know, I worried." "I know," Severus said. "I should confess that I appreciate your Lily smiled. "Thank you, Severus. If you'll excuse me. I'm sure there is studying I yet need to do." Lily's mouth quirked. "We've only got one practical exam left." "Yes, well, one can never learn too much." Severus inwardly scoffed at himself. 2 decades a spy, and he couldn't hold a conversation with a 16-year-old girl. "That's we," said. She grinned at him and added, as though quoting, "You are such a Ravenclaw." "Better a closet Ravenclaw than a shameless Gryffindor," Severus replied, the customary retort coming to his lips as easily as it had when he'd been 15. Lily looked as though she was likely to burst into either laughter or tears. "Well, secret son of Rowena," she said at last, "you'll probably want this." She held out a bedraggled object Severus belatedly recognized as his own school bag. "I can't believe you left it out there. You're usually so protective of it." Severus took it from her with a slight bow. "My thanks," he said. Lily smiled wryly. "Say whatever else about those Slytherins you've been keeping company with," she said, "but at least they've improved your manners." Severus blushed. He blushed for Merlin's sake, and nodded to her. "Good day, Lily," he said, and turned to enter the castle. "Severus," Lily called. We are friends." Severus glanced back at her. "As I've never had another," he said, feeling bolder at that moment than he had when he'd willingly gone to his death, I certainly hope so. Severus collapsed onto the green-curtained four-poster bed that he was fairly certain was his. At least it was where he'd remembered, and was surrounded by stacks of advanced dark arts and potions texts, and closed the curtains around him with a flick of his... several privacy spells later, and he was able to relax as much as he ever relaxed. He decided in 1976, to continue to consider other scenarios. That he was dead or locked in a hallucinogenic dream would only drive him mad. So, until he was given concrete evidence to the contrary, he would operate under the assumption that he had gone back to the end of his 5th year at Hogwarts. Severus lay on his back in the darkened room, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. Assuming he was, in fact, in 1976, and assume it he would have to, or face insanity. There had to be a particular reason for his return, or else life was random and meaningless, another prospect that would drive him to madness. Severus exhaled slowly. When he had died, back in the future Merlin, it had seemed that all had been going according to plan. All of Dumbledore's machinations were bearing fruit, and each of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes. Severus Snape was not the fool the Dark Lord and Dumbledore still seemed to expect him to be. He knew what it meant for a fragment of soul to live inside Harry and tie the Dark Lord to this earth. Each of the Horcruxes had, he was certain, been destroyed, with the obvious exceptions of the thrice-damned snake and the Dumbledore-damned boy. Severus had had two purposes in his miserable life, which was to protect Harry Potter and to bring down the Dark Lord, admittedly. These goals were more than somewhat related, but the thought of having had just one purpose was simply depressing. So if, upon his death, he was not cast into darkness or absorbed into the magical ether or any number of other possibilities that, frankly, he would not consider at this time, Severus turned over onto his side. It stood to reason, and Severus was big on reason. That Severus' life goal had not been achieved, and he had been sent back to 1976 in order to do the damn thing properly, or else the world would be thrust into despair, and all would perish in the blazing inferno of a Dark Lord-run, totalitarian, etc. Because the thought that he had been sent back for the purpose of correcting his own personal mistakes, the small, petty ones that had led to a life of misery, well, that was just silly. If anybody deserved that kind of second chance, well, he wasn't Severus. So Severus was here. He had to be here, in order to bring down the Dark Lord who was, if memory served, and it generally did, currently amassing followers and amusing himself with little jaunts rather than full-on reigns of terror. He pulled his knees up to his chest, Sir Laser. He was bony. When had the Dark Lord created his Horcruxes? Severus had gathered that they consisted of the diary, the damnable ring, Hufflepuff's cup, the Black's locket, and whatever the hell it was Harry Potter had been looking for in the Ravenclaw common room. And then, of course, the boy and the snake. Presumably, all but the boy and the snake had been created by 1976. Surely Severus made a mental note to look at a few choice old newspapers just to be certain, and he breathed out. He needed to destroy the Horcruxes and take down the Dark Lord before he had a chance to make an extra Horcrux or two and rise again. When the Dark Lord fell, he would fall for good. One destroyed Horcruxes with basilisk venom or with fiend fire. Severus groaned and rolled onto his back. As an adult, he had been perfectly capable of producing fiend fire, although he had never been so foolish as to do so outside of a fully controlled, warded laboratory environment. Given what had happened at the lake, he was fairly certain he would also be able to do so now, but between the trace of Merlin, that was something he hadn't had to worry about for half a lifetime, and the lack of a sufficiently warded environment, he somehow doubted a fiend fire-wielding 16-year-old would go unnoticed. And if there was one thing Severus really, really wanted, it was to be unnoticed. That left basilisk venom. Unfortunately, given how many years it had been since someone had seen a basilisk, let alone killed one, Severus chose not to think upon the enormous monster still lurking underneath the school. The cost of basilisk venom was so high that he'd have to be a Malfoy in order to afford the amount of venom necessary to destroy. Severus, he had never been too modest to admit, was a man of many skills. But charging into a secret dungeon chamber in order to slay a great mythic beast was not a scenario for which his particular skill set was suitable. Not that he couldn't do it. But when it came to devising a way to get around the limitation of an extremely limited supply of what was, essentially, when it came down to it, a potion's ingredient, Severus opened his eyes. Well, he'd just have to work a way around it, and if the theory didn't exist, which it didn't, well, he'd have to be the man who devised it. And Severus smirked and took down the protective spells around his bed. "Mr. Snape," Professor Slughorn said, his walrus mustache twitching in what Severus could only assume was surprise. "To what do I owe this? May I come in, sir?" Severus asked from the doorway. Slughorn levitated a box of candied pineapple off of one of the overplush chairs and gestured for Severus to take a seat. "What seems to be the trouble? Surely you feel pleased with your performance on the exams?" "I had no trouble with the exams," Severus said evenly, "which is my issue. Sir, I would like to sit my newts early." Slughorn frowned. "You realize that is unorthodox," he said, tapping a pudgy finger on the top of his desk. Severus inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, sir, but I believe I am wasting time here on multidisciplinary studies when I could be focusing on a truly worthy field." Slughorn smiled. "Ah, a man after my own heart, of course. So it's potions for you, is it? I rather thought it would be." "Indeed, sir. Well, Mr. Snape," Slughorn said, "as I say, it is unorthodox. But I am perfectly willing to discuss the possibility of your moving into 7th year classes next year and sitting your newts a year early. How does that sound?" He beamed at Severus, clearly expecting a bounty of gratitude. "Well, sir, that is kind of you," Severus replied, "but I was rather hoping to take this year's examination." Slughorn's eyes flew open. "Mr. Snape," he exclaimed, "I've never thought of you as having of exhibiting such a unique sense of humour. You almost had me for a moment," he chortled. "Why, the newts begin tomorrow." "I know, sir," Severus said, "which is why I came to you this evening. The lack of a challenge provided by the owls have proven to me that I have nothing to gain by remaining at this institution for another 2 years. "It simply can't be done," Slughorn said. "It's far too unorthodox. Far too unorthodox." His finger tapped the desk. "Yes, sir, but mightn't we make an exception?" Severus said. "Frankly, I can't imagine any of the professors are eager for me to remain at Hogwarts for 2 more years." Slughorn, amusingly, managed to bluster out a, "Oh no, dear boy, I don't know what you're talking about." That was almost convincing. Severus simply watched him until Slughorn relented. But still, it's simply too short notice. Severus affected a sigh. "All right, sir, I'll tell you the real reason I'm so eager to leave Hogwarts. Sir, I am afraid for my personal safety." He glanced nervously behind him at the open office door. Slughorn frowned. "I beg your pardon?" "Sir," Severus said seriously, leaning forward, "I was attacked by the lake this afternoon with no provocation whatsoever. I was hexed and publicly humiliated by a pack of 5th-year Gryffindors with no sense of consequences, and I have absolutely no doubt that it will happen again." Slughorn waved a hand dismissively. "Youthful, high spirits," he said. "I'm sure there was no malevolence behind it. They're just boys, after all." "Technically," Severus said lightly, "one is a dangerous dark creature who should not, legally speaking, even be at this school." Slughorn blinked. He stared. He quickly waved his wand and the door of his office closed with a smooth snick. "That," he said quietly, "is a rather serious accusation you make, Mr. Snape." "It is," Severus agreed. "Such things are not to be said lightly. I wouldn't dream of it." Slughorn leaned back and stared at him. "You want to sit this year's newts?" he said at last. "Yes, sir," Severus said. "Which?" "Potions, naturally," Severus said, swallowing back the crow of triumph that had uncharacteristically risen in his chest. and defense, charms, transfigurations, and herbology, of course, and also arithmancy and ancient rune. That's all? Slughorn asked mildly. Yes, sir. Very well, Slughorn said. I'll see what can be arranged. Severus stood. Thank you, sir. I truly appreciate it. Slughorn waved him away with one wide hand. Severus left the office, feeling Slughorn's eyes on him all the way. When he arrived at Dumbledore's office, Slughorn was waiting for him outside the gargoyles. Ah, Mr. Snape, he said. The very man. Severus inclined his head. Good evening, Professor. Slughorn turned to the gargoyle and said, Ziggy Stardust. The gargoyle stood aside. After you, Mr. Snape, Slughorn said with a wave of his hand, and Severus started up the spiralling staircase. Minerva and Dumbledore, Severus' mental shields, slammed into place, were waiting for them within. If Severus had been a less practiced spy, it would have been too much for him. Here was a Dumbledore untouched by a debilitating curse, a Dumbledore not killed by Severus' unwilling hand, and perhaps he was imagining that he could see it, but a Dumbledore who didn't view him solely as a soulless weapon to be wielded against the Dark Lord. Good evening, Headmaster, Severus said. Severus, my boy, Dumbledore said. Please have a seat. Severus took the centre chair. Slughorn sat to his left. McGonagall hovered behind the chair to the right. Dumbledore leaned over his desk. So, he said, Professor Slughorn tells me that you are interested in, nay, you insist upon. I would appreciate the opportunity, Severus replied.